I had ruled Lorette for 6 years with a heart carved from Sicilian ice, treating the world's most dangerous men as data points, and my head of security as a shadow. Nik Kovač was the silent architecture of my life. A 6'2" wall of muscle with eyes that held the cold, flat finality of a locked door. To me, he was a weapon, a ghost in a bespoke suit, who existed only to bleed for me. That delusion shattered at the Winter Gala. I was mid-sentence, negotiating a digital blockade against the Kremlin with the Council of Sovereigns, a group of elite power brokers who pulled the world's strings. When I felt the air shift, Adriana Cruz, the FBI director's daughter, ignored me, the most powerful woman in the room. She walked straight past, stopping inches from Nik. She didn't view him as a bodyguard. She saw him as a prize. Her hand slid upward, fingers tracing the line of his jaw, a territory I had never dared to touch. Nik. His name slipped from her lips like a soft melody. I've watched you for months. I dream of moments with you. A pause, her breath ghosting against his mouth. Be my man. I waited for Nik to dismiss her with his usual professional edge. Instead, he remained still. He didn't look to me for permission. His eyes darkened as he gave her that one thing I assumed I owned, his attention. In that heartbeat, the ice around my soul didn't just crack. It vaporized into a blinding, murderous red. Before we continue, if you've made it this far, you're officially part of the inner circle. Hit that like button right now and subscribe to Sovereign Obsession. You do not want to miss how this ice finally breaks. Comment Queen's Obsession with your city to have your name engraved in this empire of power and loyalty. The drive back to the penthouse was a vacuum. The partitioned glass of the Maybach felt like the walls of a tomb, reinforced and cold. Nik sat behind the wheel, his silhouette a rigid, unyielding line against the blurring city lights. His eyes remained fixed on the asphalt, never drifting to the rear view, never seeking mine. For 6 years, this silence had been my sanctuary, the quiet proof of a machine in perfect working order. Tonight, that silence was a scream. I looked down at my hands. My deep red nails matched the color of the rage still simmering in my gut, a slow boiling resentment I couldn't quite categorize. My mother, Elena Esposito, always preached that emotion was a leak in the hull of a ship. Stay emotional, and you sink. She had built the foundations of Rete on the raw grief of my father's murder, but she'd processed that pain into a weapon of pure logic. She turned the invisibles, the hungry, the janitors, the overlooked maids, into a network of ghosts. I had inherited that shield, polishing it until it was a mirror that reflected only what I wanted the world to see. But tonight, staring at the back of Nik's head, that mirror was cracked. It didn't reflect a queen. It reflected a woman terrified of being replaced by a girl who didn't know the weight of a secret. The city lights smeared against the Maybach's window, a bouquet of gold and neon that mocked the vacuum inside. I leaned my head against the cool leather, my mind retreating to the only place where things still possessed a linear sense, the beginning. Nik hadn't always been a shadow. 8 years ago, he was the son of Dragan Kovač, my mother's legendary enforcer, a man who moved with the weight of a landslide and spoke only in absolute truths. When Dragan died taking a bullet meant for my mother, she didn't just offer Nik a job, she offered him a tether. He had come to us fresh from the special forces, his eyes carrying that 1,000-yard stare that suggested he'd seen the worst the world had to offer, and decided he was meaner than all of it. For 2 years, he was my mother's creature. I watched from the sidelines, a princess in a fortress of whispers, as she taught him the secret geography of our empire. It wasn't about maps of the streets. It was about the maps of the hallways. She showed him how a janitor in a courthouse or a technician in the Pentagon could be more lethal than a sniper if they simply knew what to listen for. She taught him that power isn't in the gun, it's in the ear that hears the hammer cock. Then 6 years ago, the world stopped. When my mother died, the transition was bloodless but brutal. I stepped into her heels and immediately began to chill the air around me. I took her invisible army and scaled it with a ruthlessness she never dared. My mother built Lorette on the street, feeding the hungry so they would watch the alleys. I took those roots and grew them into a global forest of surveillance. I didn't just want eyes in the gutters, I wanted them in the glass towers. I embedded my invisibles into the backrooms of Washington, D.C., the high-frequency trading floors of Wall Street, the corporate boardrooms of London, and the judicial chambers of Tokyo. My trade was no longer just survival. It was the global architecture of leverage. I knew which senator in the Capitol liked the taste of copper, and which CEO in Manhattan was funneling millions into offshore ghosts. I was the architect of an invisible panopticon. And Nik? I made him the silent pillar of that new, colder world. I remember the day I took over. I looked him in the eye, the last time I truly let myself see the man behind the protocol, and told him his name was no longer Nik. To the world, and to me, he was security. He was a system. I don't need a friend, Nik, I had whispered, the grief from my mother sharpening my voice into a surgical blade. I need a ghost. I need a shadow that doesn't feel. Then a ghost is what you shall have, Elena, he had replied. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated in my chest, a promise he had kept for 2,190 days. Until tonight. Tonight, Adriana Cruz didn't see a ghost. She saw a man, the warmth I had spent 6 years not seeing. Staring at the rigid line of his neck from the back seat, I realized with a sickening jolt that Nik could be something more than just my shadow. It was a glitch in my reality, a variable I hadn't accounted for in my pristine architecture. The Queen of Information had no data on how to handle the weave of jealousy beginning to live in my heart. No protocol for how to make his eyes look at me only, not with the cold focus of a guard, but through his heart, as the only woman his attention was ever meant for. The subterranean garage was a cavern of reinforced concrete and recycled air, smelling of high-octane exhaust and the expensive hand-buffed wax on the Maybach's hood. The car came to a smooth, haunting halt, but for the first time in 2,000 days, Nik didn't move to open my door. He sat like a statue carved from obsidian, his large hands still gripping the leather steering wheel at 10 and 2. The silence was a physical wall between us, thick and suffocating. I pushed the door open myself, the click of the latch sounding like a gunshot in the stillness of the vault. My heels hit the pavement with a sharp, aggressive rhythm, the sound of a queen reasserting her borders, as I marched toward the private elevator. Nik was behind me instantly. He didn't speak, but his presence had changed. He was no longer the invisible shadow. He had developed a weight, a gravity that pulled at the air around me. Inside the elevator's mirrored box, the LED lights were clinical and unforgiving. I stared at our reflections. I was all black silk and gold-etched edges, the undisputed sovereign of Rete, draped in a darkness that shimmered with the cold value of an empire. He was a pillar of granite, eyes tracking the floor numbers as if they were the only things keeping him grounded. "You're relieved, Nik," I said, my voice cutting through the hum. "I'll have the perimeter team handle the penthouse. Go, enjoy your prize." "It's not about a prize, Elena." He dropped the formal ma'am like lead, and the omission felt like a slap. His eyes finally met mine in the mirror, dark and turbulent. "It's about air. I've been holding my breath for 6 years in the vacuum you created. Tomorrow night, I'm taking a date. Not as your ghost, not as your protocol. As a man who still remembers how to live." The doors chimed open with a cheerful ping that felt like an insult. He walked past me into the foyer before I could find the words to strike back, leaving me standing in the center of my own empire, feeling the first true frost of a winter I had invited in. The feed was high-definition agony. Nik pulled out a chair for Adriana Cruz. She was soft where I was sharp, wearing a dress the color of a summer sunset, while I sat draped in shadows. I saw him smile, a real, effortless expression I hadn't seen since my mother was alive. When Adriana leaned in, her presence invading the personal space I had policed for 6 years. My hand clenched so hard the crystal groaned. I was the most powerful woman in the digital world, capable of toppling regimes with a keystroke, yet I was reduced to a common voyeur, watching another woman claim the proximity I had treated as a cold necessity, now realizing it was my most guarded treasure. He wasn't scanning for threats or checking the kitchen exits. He was giving her his undivided focus until he reached for his wine. His gaze swept the room with practiced ease, but for a fraction of a heartbeat, his eyes snagged on the floral arrangement. He didn't break the rhythm of the conversation. He simply looked directly into the microscopic lens, a silent acknowledgement that he knew exactly which note I was using to watch him. The sound of his laugh after that look didn't just touch the cracks in my Sicilian ice. It turned the thaw into a flash flood of resentment. The frozen wall around my heart detonated. I wasn't just losing a head of security. I was watching the only man who truly knew the girl behind the mask look at someone else as if I had already ceased to exist. The penthouse had become a vacuum by the time he returned. I sat in the library, the only room where my invisibles didn't have a lens, where the air was thick with the scent of old paper and the truth I could no longer outrun. The heavy oak door groaned open. I didn't turn. I stayed silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city of New York spread out below me like a toy set I no longer wanted to play with. "You're late," I said, the words sounding brittle even to my own ears. "I'm off duty, Elena." His voice was a low, cautious rumble from the doorway. "Or did you forget your own standing order?" I turned slowly. He stood at the threshold, his tie loosened, the top button of his shirt undone. I imagined I could smell the phantom scent of that woman's floral perfume, clinging to the cotton of his shirt, and my stomach turned with a physical sickness. "I watched you tonight," I said, my silk robe whispering against the floor as I crossed the distance. "I saw you through a lens I shouldn't have used. I saw you smile at her, Nik. A real smile, the kind that hasn't touched your face since the day we buried Sophia." Nik's jaw set like a vice. His eyes searched mine, looking for the game, the tactical objective, the inevitable lie. "Why, Elena? To see if I was still human?" "I sat here in the dark, and I hated her," I whispered, stopping inches from him. The heat radiating off his body was a direct challenge to the chill of the room. "She tried to touch what belongs to the crown. You are mine, Nik." I've spent 6 years convincing myself I didn't need to say it out loud, but seeing her with you changed the geometry of everything. I lifted my hand, letting him see it rise. My fingers found his jaw, the forbidden territory I had lived in fear of touching for a decade. He went perfectly still. It wasn't the trained stillness of a guard, it was the paralyzed stillness of a man afraid that if he moved, the hallucination would evaporate. "She touched you here," I said, my thumb tracing the edge of his lower lip. And I stood by. I am done standing by. I am done being the queen of a hollow castle. She was looking for a man, Elena. For the first time in 6 years, I let myself be one. "You don't get to be jealous of a life you know nothing about." "I am not jealous," I snapped, the lie tasting like copper on my tongue. I gripped his lapels, my nails digging into the expensive cotton of his shirt. "I am a sovereign protecting her borders. You are the shadow I cast. And I have done nothing to deserve the loyalty you've given me. I'm done being the protocol. Tonight, I am choosing the man." His hands gripped my wrists, pinning me with a strength that vibrated through my very bones. His eyes burned with a starving, ancient fire. "Is that what I am to you? A territory to be defended? A piece of the web?" "No," I breathed, rising on my toes until our breaths mingled. "You're the only heir I have left in a world of ghosts." I claimed his mouth. It wasn't a request. It was a sovereign decree, a desperate, clawing attempt to reclaim a soul I had realized, too late, was being snatched from right under my hands. For a heartbeat, he was frozen, the ghost of his father dragon flickering in his eyes. Then the protocol died. His hands found my waist, his grip fierce enough to bruise, pulling me into him as if he were trying to merge our very shadows. When his mouth crashed back against mine, the Sicilian ice didn't just melt, it turned to screaming steam. The architecture was burning, and for the first time in my life, I wanted to be in the center of the fire. That night, on silk sheets that felt like a battlefield, I realized the most dangerous thing in the room wasn't my empire or my enemies. It was the man who held me like I was the only thing worth saving in a collapsing world. The morning light was a cold gray intrusion, slicing through the heavy velvet curtains of the bedroom. I woke not to the silence of my sanctuary, but to the rhythmic, calibrated hum of my tablet on the nightstand, a digital pulse of red notifications that signaled a systemic breach. Beside me, the space was empty, though the sheets were still warm, smelling of cedar and the heavy, lingering scent of a broken rule. "Nik," I called out, my voice raspy and stripped of its royal edge. "We're under fire, the web is tearing at the seams." He appeared in the doorway, already dressed in a fresh black tactical shirt, his holster snug against his ribs. The softness of the night before, the way he had whispered my name into the hollow of my throat, was gone, replaced by the lethal, singular focus of the son of Nik Kovač. His eyes drifted to the seal on the balcony door, scanning the tree line before dropping to the tablet in my hand. "How bad?" I stood, wrapping the silk robe around me with the deliberate grace of a queen donning armor. I walked to the wall-mounted screen and swiped it to life. The global map of Rete appeared, bleeding out in real time. "The Index," I said, my voice like dry ice. "The international network for discreet exchange." They weren't just a syndicate. They were the architects of the world's most shadow-drenched deals. My surveillance network was no longer just a nuisance to them. It was a mirror they had deemed a terminal necessity to break. I watched as 3 gold pins, my invisibles in Paris, flickered and turned gray. They aren't just about ending my existence. They're trying to destroy every inch of my empire. They're hitting my nervous system. I tapped the London cluster, watching 2 more pins go dark. Sophia built this to protect the small. I built it to watch the giants. My people are the white noise of global power, the janitors at the Quai d'Orsay, the technicians at the Bourse. The index is lobotomizing me. They're cutting the eyes out of my head so they can move in the dark again. Without the invisibles, I'm just a woman with a bank account and a target on her back that everyone can see. They've found a way in, Nik said, his voice dropping as he tracked the data. To hit this many nodes at once, they've already bypassed the architecture. They have the keys. A cold stillness settled over me, deeper than any Sicilian ice. I looked at the man who had held me for 6 hours. The only vault I had ever truly trusted. The codes are biometric, Nik. They're tied to us. Both of us. The realization was clinical. I had spent 6 years keeping him at a distance to keep us both safe. But by finally bringing him into my bed, I had centralized the target. I had made our vulnerability a single point of failure. Nik's hand found the small of my back. Protective. Possessive. Then we stopped watching from the towers, he said, his voice turning back into the granite of a soldier. If Paris is dark, DC is the next target. We dress, we move. Wait, I said, leaning toward the screen. A new alert was flashing in DC. Director Cruz, Adriana's father. He's launching a coordinated raid on our physical server farm in Virginia. The index isn't just attacking us. They're using the Bureau as their legal front. I watched the logistics map update in real time. It was a masterpiece of institutional destruction. The index provided the untraceable intel, while the FBI provided the badges and the warrants to dismantle my empire under the color of law. I looked at Nik. The air in the room grew thin. The date, I whispered. The realization sharp and cold as a razor under the tongue. It wasn't just a provocation, Nik. It was a Trojan horse. They sent Adriana's father to pin us down legally, so they could send the others to finish us physically. On the high-definition feed, black SUVs cracked open like armored eggs. These weren't agents in windbreakers. They were agents of massacre. The Markovs. Nik's voice was flat, clinical, the tone he used for body counts. The men disgorging from the vehicles moved with the practiced ease of 100 slaughterhouses. They didn't fan out or secure a perimeter. They simply walked toward the warehouse, weapons rhythmic and relentless, shredding the doors before they were even open. This was the Markov Brotherhood, the index's blunt force instrument, forged in the literal and figurative fires of Brighton Beach. While my invisibles moved through shadows collecting secrets, these men moved through walls collecting bodies. They didn't hack servers, they put bullets in them. They didn't flip assets. They broke spines until someone talked. The first thermite charge detonated. White-hot light flooded the screen, the chemical fire eating through reinforced steel like paper. Nik was already at the concealed armory doors, his movements a blur of lethal economy. He checked his sidearm, the slide racking with a heavy metallic clack that signaled the end of the sanctuary of silence. Then let's go burn the bridge, Nik said, his eyes meeting mine with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. We give them the fight they're looking for, but on your terms, Elena, not theirs. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for the grid. My fingers danced across the holographic console, bypassing municipal firewalls, enslaving the city's nervous system to my singular will. I dropped the curtain on Brooklyn. In the borough below, the city itself turned predator. I triggered the warehouse hub's industrial fire suppression systems, drenching the Markov soldiers in a deluge of freezing chemical foam that turned the concrete into a treacherous skating rink. With a flurry of keystrokes, I manipulated the Department of Transportation's traffic AI, locking every light for a 10-block radius into a solid, unmoving red. Reinforcements vanished into a gridlocked maze of idling yellow cabs and screaming sirens. They're boxed in, Nik noted, his voice calm as he tracked the heat signatures on the thermal overlay. Blind, stationary, and trapped in a bottle of your making. Not just blind. I activated the janitor's key. Across the district, every smart lock on the gates the Markovs had tagged for their escape engaged simultaneously. The invisibles, the maintenance crews, the toll operators, the night shift technicians didn't have to fire a single shot. They simply stepped back into the shadows and let the architecture become a cage. It was the ultimate expression of Rete, power through the mundane. I watched the grainy, high-angle feed as the Russians floundered in a sea of foam and urban gridlock. It was a victory of cold logic over raw muscle, until a new alert flashed a sharp, clinical blue. Federal blue. "Nik," I said, the small spark of triumph in my chest turning to cold ash. The street war was just the bait, the distraction. The NYPD is being sidelined by a jurisdictional override, and the FBI is moving in to restore order. I zoomed out the map, my heart hammering against my ribs. The blue icons weren't converging on the warehouse fire or the Russian blockade. They were a coordinated, lethal arrowhead aimed directly at this penthouse. Director Cruz hadn't come to stop a mafia war. He had come to finish one. And at the tip of the spear, leading the tactical breach team, was Adriana. The elevator chimed, not with the private code I had refreshed an hour ago, but with a forced, high-level override. On the monitors, the lobby was a sea of black tactical gear and FBI windbreakers. At the center of the formation stood Adriana Cruz. Her evening gown from the gala was gone, replaced by a Kevlar vest and a sidearm. Her soft, melodic voice was now a barked command into a comms link. She moved with the efficiency of a predator who had finally cornered its prey after a long, patient hunt. "Nik, they're in the shaft," I said, my fingers flying across the console to engage the secondary hydraulic deadbolts. "But they aren't blowing the doors, they're using a bypass, a clean one." I watched the screen, expecting the violent flash of a thermal breach, or a kinetic charge. Instead, the keypad on the reinforced foyer door turned a calm, mocking green. For the first time, the cold logic of my world failed me. How? I changed those encryption cycles this morning. The math is impossible. Nik stepped into the space between me and the entrance, a 6'2" wall of lethal intent. He didn't look back. His weapon was leveled at the seam of the door, his stance as unyielding as the granite he had become. The heavy door slid open with a hiss of pressurized air. Adriana stepped through the gap first. She wasn't in the soft silk of our previous encounters. She was in tactical black, her weapon lowered but her eyes bright with the predatory satisfaction of a problem solved. She didn't spare a glance for me, the woman who supposedly controlled the digital world. She was looking at Nik with the triumphant gaze of an architect, looking at a finished building they intended to demolish. "Step away from the terminal, Nik," she said, her voice echoing in the marble foyer. "We have the warrant. We have the probable cause from the Brooklyn terrorist incident you just orchestrated. And thanks to our dinner at Bistro Loeb, we have the keys to your kingdom." I looked at the tablet in her hand. It wasn't standard FBI issue. The hardware was modified with a high-frequency biometric skimmer. "The wine glass," I whispered, the realization cutting deeper than any bullet could. "The hand on your jaw at the gala, the laughter. She wasn't just touching you, Nik. She was harvesting you." "Retinal scan from the candlelight," Adriana confirmed, a cold professional smirk touching her lips. "Vocal patterns from the laughter. High-res thumbprints from the stem of your crystal glass. You're a hard man to crack, Nik. A real ghost. But even a ghost leaves a digital signature if he stays in the light long enough. And you stayed in the light for me." She hadn't been fishing for a man. She had been building a skeleton key. By seducing the shadow, she had bypassed the Queen's entire defense. She had realized that the only way to get to the heart of Rete was through the man I had finally allowed myself to love. "The warrant is a formality, Elena," Adriana said, finally acknowledging me with a flick of her gaze. "My father wants your servers to bolster his climb to the Attorney General's office. The Index wants your silence to protect their offshore interests. And I?" She tilted her head, the same gesture she'd used at the gala. "I wanted to be the one who took everything from the woman who thought she was untouchable. Since you've been so kind as to centralize all your invisible data into one biometric vault, we only need Nik to stand still while we download the archive. You've made it so easy for us." Nik didn't move. He didn't lower his gun, even as the red laser dots of the tactical team blossomed across his chest like a field of digital poppies. "You have the signatures," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that made the glass walls hum. "But you forgot one thing about the architecture of this house. You studied the doors, but you didn't study the architect." "And what's that?" Adriana asked, her team leveling their rifles. "The Queen doesn't just build doors," Nik growled, his eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second. A silent signal for the storm to come. "She builds traps, and she never builds a trap she isn't willing to fall into herself." The air in the room grew heavy with the sudden sharp scent of ozone. I reached for the master override, the Night of Long Knives protocol. I had built this protocol for a scenario exactly like this. The moment when the law came for me with the law on its side. It was a scorched earth policy. It would burn more than this penthouse. It would burn reputations, careers, and the very fabric of the index. I looked at Nik, at the red dots on his chest, at the woman who had used him as a tool. My thumb pressed against the scanner. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with a dial tone. When the scanner accepted my print, the sprawling crystalline chandeliers of the penthouse didn't just flicker. They died. In their place, the eerie rhythmic pulse of red emergency strobes transformed the room into a fever dream of blood-colored light and jagged shifting shadows. "What did you do?" Adriana screamed. Her voice was now thin and frayed. "I didn't just cut the power, Adriana," I said, the red light catching the edges of my silk robe. "I released the invisibles. At this moment, every encrypted ledger, every recorded bribe, and every offshore blood account belonging to your father and the index leadership is flooding the public domain. The ghost is out of the bottle." The tactical team hesitated. Their unity fractured as their comms links erupted with the frantic, distorted voices of their superiors. But the penthouse was no longer a room for negotiation. It was a kill box. "Kill the terminal," Adriana's order was a shriek of pure desperation. Before the lead agent could pivot his rifle, Nik detonated. In the strobing red glare of the emergency lights, he was a silhouette of fluid, terrifying violence. He closed the gap in a heartbeat, his palm striking a chin with a sickening crack, before a second agent was disarmed with a wrist lock. So precise it sounded like dry wood snapping. Then the glass didn't just break, it detonated. The floor-to-ceiling windows shattered under a deafening roar of gunfire and pressure. The vacuum of the 58th floor rushed in. A howling gale of New York wind that whipped my hair across my face and mixed with the metallic sting of gunpowder. Nik used a man's body as a shield, his sidearm barking 3 times in rapid succession. I didn't hide. I stood at the center of the command hub, the architect of this chaos, watching my silent shadow finally step into his own light. Every inch of distance I had forced between us for 6 years was being compressed into this single, explosive moment of possession. "Down!" Nik roared. I dropped behind the reinforced mahogany as a burst of submachine gun fire shredded the leather chair I had occupied moments ago. I didn't feel fear, I felt a cold, soaring clarity. On my handheld, the invisibles were reporting in. Paris was dark, but the data leak had hit the bourse. London was in chaos. In DC, Director Cruz's private servers were screaming under the weight of 1,000,000 simultaneous downloads. I looked up. Adriana was pinned behind a marble pillar, her face pale. "The archive is out, Adriana," I shouted over the screaming wind. "Your father is a ghost. The index is a memory. You're fighting for a kingdom that turned to ash 10 minutes ago." Nik reached the edge of the terminal, his chest heaving, a dark smear of blood across his cheekbone. He didn't wait for a nod. He caught the back of my neck, pulling me into the hard, solid heat of his chest, with a desperate, bruising force. "The terrace," he gritted out. "The extraction is 3 minutes out. We go now, or we go down with the building." "I'm not leaving the servers," I said, my fingers digging into his forearm. "The servers are gone, Elena. You killed them." He spun me toward the open wound where the window had been. Below us, the city was a carpet of lights, unaware that its masters had just been unmasked. "You chose the woman. Now act like her and move." He threw a flashbang into the center of the foyer. The world turned white. In that pocket of blindness, he scooped me up, his grip fierce, and leapt through the shattered frame onto the terrace. The wind up here was a physical wall. Nik set me down against the stone balustrade, his body shielding mine from the stray rounds chipping away at the masonry. He looked at me then, really looked at me. In the raw, unfiltered moonlight, there was no queen and no guard, just 2 people standing on the edge of the world they had just set on fire. "You're mine," he whispered, the words lost to anyone but me. The data didn't change that. It just finally caught up. I looked up at the stealth rotor descending through the smoke, then back at the man whose arms were the only solid thing left. The stealth rotors of the Vesper 4 didn't beat against the air so much as they tore through it. The extraction had been a miracle of timing, a literal hook from the sky. As the winch retracted and the pressurized bay door hissed shut, the chaotic roar of the New York wind was replaced by the sterile, clinical hum of the cabin. I collapsed against the jump seat, my breath coming in uneven, burning hitches. My silk robe was a ruin, stained with the gray dust of pulverized marble and a spray of copper that wasn't mine. Beside me, Nik was a silhouette of sharp, broken edges. He didn't sit. He stood by the bulkhead, his chest heaving, his split knuckles bleeding onto the polished deck. "Status," he rasped. I flipped open my handheld. The Night of Long Knives protocol is at 100% penetration. The index isn't just leaking, it's hemorrhaging. By dawn, the names Cruz and Markov will be synonymous with the greatest political collapse in modern history. I looked up at him, my eyes stinging. "We didn't just win, Nik. We erased them." He finally turned. The adrenaline was receding, leaving behind a raw vulnerability. He walked toward me, his movements heavy, and sank onto the bench opposite mine. The silence between us wasn't the cold, professional vacuum of the last 6 years. It was a bridge. "You killed it all," he whispered. "The empire, the invisibles, the leverage. You burned the throne to save the man." "I burned it because I realized the man was the only thing I truly needed," I replied. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I took his hand. I spent 6 years telling myself that control was the only way to survive. But I was wrong. My empire was the cage, and you were the only part of my life that was actually real. Nik's grip tightened. "They didn't find a breach, Elena. They found a man who was tired of being a shadow. When Adriana looked at me, she saw a target. When you look at me, I don't even know what you see anymore." "I see the only person who ever truly chose me," I said, leaning forward until our foreheads touched. "Everyone else saw a function, a queen, a repository for secrets. You're the only one who saw the woman behind the code." The aircraft tilted sharply as it banked toward the Atlantic. Outside the porthole, New York was a dying ember on the horizon. The city was waking up to a world where the old gods had been unmasked. An hour later, we were over open water. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber. I stood and walked to the small galley, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a cup. I handed it to Nik. He took a long, slow swallow, his eyes never leaving mine. "What happens now?" he asked. "The index is dead, but they have survivors. They'll spend the rest of their lives hunting the woman who ruined them." "Let them hunt," I said, a cold, sovereign spark returning to my eyes. "I gave the invisibles the keys to their own lives tonight. They have the evidence they need to disappear, or to fight back. But I kept a few things for us." I swiped a hidden partition on my device. A single golden icon pulsed. The Sanctuary of Silence wasn't just a car, Nik. It was a server, a localized node containing the identities of the index's heirs. I didn't leak that, I kept it as our insurance. Nik set the cup down and stood, pinning me against the bulkhead. He was so close I could smell the gunpowder and salt on his skin. "Insurance," he murmured. "Always the strategist." "I have to be," I whispered, my hand sliding up his chest to rest over his heart. It was beating fast, a frantic human rhythm that mocked the cold logic of my machines. But the strategy has changed. No more 6-year rules, no more buffers. You aren't my guard anymore, Nik. You're my consort, my equal. He didn't wait for me to finish. He leaned down and claimed my mouth, a slow, deep promise that tasted of iron and victory. "I was never just your guard, Elena," he said against my lips. "I was just waiting for you to realize that a shadow only exists as long as there's a light. You're the light. I'm just the one who makes sure nothing ever puts it out." As the sun began to bleed over the Atlantic, I stood at the rear of the craft, looking back at the world we had left behind. My handheld chimed. One final message from London. It was a video file recorded by a janitor in Parliament. It showed the panicked faces of men who thought they were untouchable, watching their secrets scroll across the morning news. I deleted the file. I didn't need to see it anymore. "Elena," Nik called from the front. He was standing by the pilot's chair, the morning light catching the sharp angles of his face. He looked at peace. He held out a hand. I walked toward him, leaving the glowing screens and digital ghosts behind. I took his hand, the warmth of his skin, the only data point that mattered. The Sicilian ice had melted. The architecture had burned. "Where to?" the pilot asked. Nik looked at me. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere the silence doesn't need to be forced." I squeezed his hand. "The Azores. And pilot, turn off the transponder. From now on, we're invisible." As the stealth craft vanished into the clouds, the world below began to rebuild itself, in the image of the truth we had released. The queen was gone. The ghost was gone. But for the first time in 6 years, Elena and Nik were finally, truly, alive. What did you think of Elena's transformation from the cold queen of Rete to a woman who would burn it all for love? Was the Invisible's leak enough justice, or did you want more blood? Let us know in the comments. For more stories of power, passion, and betrayal, subscribe to Sovereign Obsession and turn on the notification bell. Don't get left in the dark. See you in the next one.